My name is Isla Monroe. I am 42 years old, and I am an emergency room physician. My days begin and end with urgency, with hands pressing against broken ribs, with monitors beeping in frantic rhythms, with families crying out names while I fight to keep one more life from slipping away. I thought I had grown immune to cruelty because I witnessed death daily. But cruelty wears many faces, and the sharpest one came from those who shared my blood. The night of my brother Daniel's wedding should have been filled with music and celebration. Instead, I was trapped in the ER after a highway collision, sent half a dozen bodies through our doors. While I was rushing between operating bays, my son Ethan was standing at the threshold of my parents' house. He was only 10 years old, dressed carefully in a crisp white shirt. He clutched a tiny velvet box in his hand. Inside was a polished tie clip he had saved allowance for weeks to buy. His only wish was to hand it to his uncle and be part of the moment. But when the door opened, warmth never came. My mother looked down at him, her pearls glinting in the light, and said with a cold smile, "There is no room for you." Behind her, my father leaned casually against the wall, drink in hand, as if dismissing a child was a small matter. From the dining room came Clara's voice, my new sister-in-law, light, airy, and cruel all at once. Seats are already reserved for important guests. That single sentence carved into my son more deeply than a shouted insult. Ethan did not cry. He nodded, shoulders tight, his knuckles white around the small gift. He turned away without argument. No one followed him. No one asked if he had eaten. He walked 3 blocks alone to a bus stop, climbed aboard surrounded by strangers in suits and dresses, and rode silently to the empty house where I had left the lights on for him. When he arrived, he set the tie clip on the kitchen counter and opened the fridge. He pulled out a slice of bread and spread peanut butter across it with clumsy strokes, then placed a half-eaten apple next to it. That became his dinner while music, toasts, and laughter filled the house where he was not welcome. I came home after midnight. My scrubs were stiff with dried blood, my muscles aching from compressions that had failed to save a man twice my size. I pushed the door open and saw Ethan at the table, his food untouched. His eyes were swollen, his mouth pressed thin. He lifted his head and whispered, "I guess I don't belong to them." His little hands folded the napkin neatly, as though he needed to make order out of rejection. The unopened gift lay beside him. It was the image of that box, so carefully chosen, so quickly discarded, that pierced me deeper than any scalpel. In that moment, exhaustion left me. A different clarity took over. I did not drive back to confront them. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I reached for pen and paper the next morning. My letter was precise, signed with my full name, and stripped of apology. It ended every dollar of support I had ever given them. Mortgage, insurance, utilities, medical bills. When they found it, the street echoed with their fury. My mother's voice cut sharp through the morning air. "You are no daughter of ours." My father shouted behind her, his rage more about lost money than lost blood. Neighbors peered through curtains, startled by the noise. But I stood still, watching, knowing this was not the sound of family breaking. This was the sound of family being exposed. That night, as Ethan quietly picked at cold bread, I understood a truth I had avoided for years. Silence can crush a spirit, but silence, wielded with precision, can also cut deeper than any blade. That was the night my silence became my weapon. I have never been the kind of woman who bends easily. I was raised in a house where approval was a currency I could never afford. I was the daughter who read too much, who questioned rules, who wanted more than what was placed in front of me. My parents called me difficult. They accused me of being ungrateful. They laughed when I said I would become a doctor. But while they spoke, I worked. I studied by lamplight. I earned scholarships. I carved out a career that saved lives every day. In the ER, hesitation costs lives. I learned to anticipate 3 moves ahead. I learned to keep my breathing even when the room filled with chaos. That same clarity shaped the way I handled my family. To them, I was never simply a daughter. I was a resource. When their roof leaked, I paid for repairs. When their medical bills piled high, I covered the balance. When their electricity was cut, it was my card number that restored the lights. I did it quietly, believing that protecting them was my duty. But duty without respect is poison. They never said thank you. They never acknowledged the sacrifices. To them, my success was not a point of pride. It was a bottomless well they could draw from. I was never celebrated at the table. I was the invisible pillar keeping it upright. I told myself endurance was strength, that patience was proof of love. I endured their slights at holidays, their favoritism toward my brother, their offhand jokes that painted me as cold or selfish. I swallowed every sting, convincing myself that family meant sacrifice. But when they turned their cruelty toward Ethan, I saw with brutal clarity the truth I had been avoiding. They had not only dismissed me, they had dismissed the boy who carried my eyes and my smile. They taught him in one merciless moment that he was disposable. That realization split something inside me. I have held dying men in my arms. I have delivered bad news with steady hands while mothers collapsed at my feet. But nothing shattered me like seeing my son, proud and hopeful, told there was no place for him at his own uncle's table. They always mistook my silence for weakness. What they never understood was that silence can also be strategy. For years I observed, I endured, and I waited. Patience, when chosen, becomes power. That night, I stopped being the daughter who gave endlessly. I became the mother who would not let cruelty repeat itself through another generation. They saw me as their wallet. They assumed I would always give, no matter the insult. But when they turned away from my son, they revealed what I truly was to them, useful only until I drew a boundary. That was their miscalculation. Because I am more than what they chose to see. I do not raise my voice. I do not beg. I act with precision. And when I act, I do not turn back. When I look back, my childhood felt like living in someone else's shadow. The house was filled with noise, but it was never for me. It was the roar of my father cheering for Daniel's soccer games, the laughter of my mother bragging about his new friends, the clinking of glasses raised to celebrate the smallest things he did. My voice, no matter how steady or clear, was always drowned out. I was the girl who sat at the kitchen table with a stack of library books taller than myself. I was the girl who memorized the constellations taped to my bedroom wall. None of that mattered to them. To my parents, I was not delightful or precocious. I was difficult. "You ask too many questions," my mother would sigh, waving me away while she ironed Daniel's shirts. "Why can't you be easy like your brother?" It was not that they hated intelligence. They just hated it in me. When Daniel rattled off trivia about a baseball player, my father ruffled his hair proudly. When I explained a science experiment I'd built with string and batteries, he raised an eyebrow and muttered, "Girls shouldn't waste time with that nonsense." The message was always the same. Curiosity in a boy was charming, but in me it was unfeminine, even threatening. One memory still claws at me. I was 12 and had stayed up nights building a model of a bridge for a science fair. I won first prize clutching a ribbon I thought might finally win their admiration. I placed it carefully on the dinner table, waiting. My father glanced at it, then at me, and said, "That's nice, but don't forget. No man wants a wife who spends all her time with her nose in a book." My mother chuckled as if it were harmless advice, but it wasn't harmless. It was crushing. Daniel smirked and reached for another roll, and the conversation moved on as if my victory had never existed. That night, I pinned the ribbon above my bed. Not because they were proud, but because I refused to let their dismissal erase what I had accomplished. The humiliation was constant, not in dramatic outbursts, but in daily reminders that I was less. When Daniel brought home a C on his report card, my parents clapped him on the shoulder. "At least you're trying," they said. When I brought home straight A's, my father narrowed his eyes. "Don't get cocky. No one likes a girl who thinks she's better than everyone else." When Daniel forgot to mow the lawn, they laughed it off as boyish laziness. If I missed one chore, my mother declared I was selfish and ungrateful. Children absorb what they are told, and I began to wonder if I truly was strange, if there was something broken inside me for wanting more than what they expected from a daughter. They painted Daniel as the pride of the family, And I was the burden, the oddity they tolerated until I could be married off and no longer their responsibility. By 16, I had grown sharper, less willing to shrink into silence. One evening, I corrected my father during a dinner conversation about a news story. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound ringing through the room. "Do not contradict me," he barked. "You're just a girl. Stop pretending you know more than you do." Daniel snickered under his breath, not out of malice, but because he had been trained, like the rest of us, to believe I was ridiculous for standing my ground. I did not cry in front of them. I saved that for later, in my room, staring at the ceiling with clenched fists. Somewhere inside, something hardened. I began to understand that their approval would never come, no matter how hard I tried. And yet, I also understood something else. I could build a life that didn't need their applause. Still, their words burrowed deep. Even as I grew older, even as I built my career, I carried the echo of those early humiliations. They taught me to anticipate rejection, to steel myself against disappointment. And that is why, when my son Ethan was pushed aside years later, I recognized the cruelty instantly. It was the same pattern, the same contempt, passed from them to him. Only this time, I would not remain the silent child. I would not let their dismissal define my family the way it had defined me. College became my first experiment in survival without applause. I applied for every grant I could find. When letters were slow, I wiped tables at a diner until my wrists ached. On weekends, I stocked shelves at a pharmacy. At night, I tutored classmates who could afford an hour. I learned to stretch a bag of rice through midterms. I learned to read on buses between shifts. When tuition notices landed like threats, I negotiated payment plans and persuaded registrars to give me one more week. No one at home sent money. What arrived were opinions about how a daughter should behave. I nodded through the advice, then I pulled another double and kept going. Medical school demanded a different stamina. I worked overnight as a unit clerk. I memorized drug interactions during 10-minute breaks. I reviewed anatomy while the laundry spun in a basement machine. Some months I slept in my car between rotations. Some nights I gripped the steering wheel and counted breaths until panic loosened its hold. When Daniel called to brag about a beach weekend, my mother chirped that he deserved a little fun. When I shared an exam score, she called me intense, as if diligence were a character flaw. I charted vitals, I practiced sutures on fruit. I learned to finish what I started without waiting for praise. After residency, I finally earned a steady paycheck. It felt like standing on a dock after years of swimming against current. My parents were behind on rent again, and the landlord hinted they might be forced out. I met him in his office, shook his hand, and wrote a check that cleared the balance. It did not feel like charity. It felt like relief that they would be safe while I built my career. A few months later, I found a small condo near their neighborhood. I signed the deed in my name and handed them the keys. They called it theirs. I told myself titles were details. Then the envelopes began arriving with my name printed in blue. Utilities, internet, pharmacy statements listing my father's medications. I added each account to my calendar and paid before the due date. When the furnace failed in January, I arranged the service call and covered the bill. When my mother slipped on the steps and needed physical therapy, I put her sessions on my card and told her to focus on healing. If neighbors asked how they were doing, she said they were comfortable because they managed money wisely. I swallowed the urge to correct the story and went back to my shift. The requests crept from necessities to comforts. First, it was a larger television so my father could read scores, then a chest freezer for holiday baking, then a patio set because guests needed somewhere nice to sit. I indulged them when I could. I said no when schedules ran thin. I learned how quickly no could turn a parent into an accuser. My mother would sigh that I had become distant. My father would grumble that I was wealthy, but withholding. I kept covering the essentials and told myself the extras would slow. They did not. Wedding planning began with modest ideas. By spring, the guest list ballooned, and so did the estimates. I was asked whether I could contribute. I answered that my support already kept their lights on and their insurance active. That was when Clara stepped in, all warmth and polish. She suggested that the monthly money I sent could be redirected. She smiled while explaining that a more impressive celebration would reflect well on the family. Daniel, she said, deserved a day that looked like success. She glanced at my mother, who nodded as if the decision had already been made. I discovered the redirection by accident. A power bill that should have been covered with my transfer arrived past due. The penalty fee glared from the corner like a warning. When I asked, my mother waved it off and mentioned that the florist wanted payment early. My father added that vendors required deposits. He promised to settle the utilities later. He did not. I paid the arrears to prevent a shutoff and told myself it was temporary. A bridge, not a pattern. The next month, another notice appeared, and I crossed the bridge again. By the time invitations went out, the condominium looked staged for a magazine. New drapes framed the windows. A gleaming sound system occupied the shelf. Catered tastings crowded my dining table when I stopped by between shifts. I stood in the doorway and felt like a stranger in a home I owned. My name anchored the mortgage. My signature authorized every account. Yet I had become a background figure in the story they told about their stability. They were hosts. I was infrastructure. When I think about the phrase financial abuse, I do not picture bruises. I picture spreadsheets. I picture automatic payments draining quietly each month. I picture overdue notices that reveal where my deposits had been diverted. I picture the arithmetic that turns love into leverage. Harm of this kind rarely shouts. It shifts assumptions until generosity becomes obligation. It trains the giver to feel guilty for wanting boundaries. During a tasting, I heard Clara lean toward my mother and murmur that my transfers could cover the band and the photographer. No need to bother me with details. My mother smiled. My father raised his glass. I stood behind them and understood exactly what had happened. That morning began with sunlight spilling across the kitchen tiles, the kind of light that makes the world feel hopeful. Ethan padded in, his hair still tousled from sleep, clutching the shirt we had set aside for the wedding. The white fabric seemed too crisp for his small frame, but when he slipped it on, he stood taller, as though the shirt had given him a new skin. He smoothed the wrinkles with both hands, proud and careful, like a young man rehearsing adulthood. On the counter lay the small velvet box, deep navy, corners slightly worn where his fingers had traced it too many times. Inside was the polished tie clip he had saved weeks to buy. Each allowance coin, each crumpled bill folded tightly into a jar, until finally he had enough to purchase something that gleamed with intention. He lifted the box as if it were delicate glass, opening it once more, though he already knew every curve of the metal. "Uncle Daniel will wear this forever, Mom," he said, his voice filled with hope. I could only smile at the innocence of his faith, the belief that love could be sealed in a small, shining object. He asked if he looked like a gentleman. I studied him, sleeves a little long, collar pressing against his neck, but his chin lifted high. I told him yes, he looked perfect. His smile widened, and for a moment he seemed older than his years. He practiced the way he would hand the gift, bowing slightly, rehearsing the words, "Congratulations, Uncle." He repeated them in front of the hallway mirror, each attempt more solemn than the last, as if preparing for a sacred ritual. I tucked a folded note with our address and phone number into his pocket, a mother's precaution from years of emergencies. He laughed at me gently, saying he wouldn't need it, but I pressed it into the fabric anyway. In my line of work, I had learned that safety is rarely wasted. He promised he would be fine, his voice steady, though his small hands kept closing over the velvet box as if anchoring his courage. The cab pulled up, humming in the driveway. Ethan climbed in, box on his lap, back straight against the seat. He waved once through the window, not wildly like a child, but deliberately, like someone beginning a journey. The driver asked if he was ready. Ethan nodded, the weight of his mission clear on his face. I stood on the porch with my stethoscope hanging around my neck, whispering a silent prayer that kindness would greet him at the door. At the hospital, the rhythm of chaos swallowed me. Alarms, running footsteps, shouted orders. My body moved on instinct, compressing chests, drawing lines, calling codes. But between moments of crisis, my thoughts drifted to him. I pictured him stepping carefully across the polished floors of the venue, carrying his velvet box as though it were a crown. I imagined him setting it gently among the glittering piles of envelopes and lavish gifts, his simple tie clip standing as proof of effort and love rather than wealth. During a short break, I checked my phone. His message was brief but steady. "I'll be okay, Mom. Don't worry." Those words tightened my throat. Around me, colleagues laughed about weekend barbecues, but I could only see my son's earnest face, dressed in white, stepping into a hall filled with champagne glasses and chandeliers. He believed he belonged there. He believed love made room for him. What I did not know, what I could not imagine in that sterile hallway, was how swiftly that faith would be betrayed. At that moment, all I could see was a boy leaving home with hope shining in his eyes, a velvet box pressed to his chest, a child convinced that family was a door that never closed. I was not at the wedding that afternoon. My shift in the ER was long, unrelenting, and unforgiving. I only pieced together the details later from Ethan's quiet words and the few witnesses who cared enough to tell me. Still, when I imagine it, I can see every frame with unbearable clarity. Ethan stood at the entrance of the grand hall, his shirt freshly ironed, the tie slightly too tight for his thin neck. In his hands, the small velvet box he had saved weeks to buy. His hair was neatly combed. He had rehearsed his smile in the mirror that morning. He believed he belonged there. After all, it was his uncle's wedding, his family's celebration. My mother was the first to greet him, though greet is far too generous. She blocked the doorway, her posture straight, her lips tight, her eyes cool. "There's no room, Ethan," she said with finality, as though it were not a matter of chairs, but of bloodlines. Behind her, Clara appeared. Her new silk dress shimmered in the lights, her hair sculpted into perfect waves. She smiled, soft at the far edges, but sharpened underneath. She lowered her voice as if speaking kindly, though every syllable struck like ice. "Seats are already reserved for important guests. You understand, don't you, sweetheart?" Her words were coated in sugar, but the venom was impossible to miss. From a few steps inside the room, my father lifted his beer with deliberate slowness, watching the foam slide down the glass. He said nothing. He did not protest. He did not call Ethan by name. He simply turned toward the music as though my son's presence was nothing but a minor inconvenience. The crowd behind them laughed, plates clinked, silverware scraped against porcelain. Music floated through the air, muffled only by the door they kept between my son and themselves. And in that noise, in that bustle, not a single voice suggested a solution. No chair pulled closer, no promise that dessert would make space sweeter. Just silence, and a door that never fully opened. Ethan shifted the velvet box in his hand, clutching it tightly against his chest. He looked from one adult face to another, searching for softness, for someone to rescue him. But all he saw were smiles rehearsed for photographs and eyes that passed over him like a shadow. Finally, Clara's hand touched my mother's arm, a subtle gesture of dismissal, and the two women drifted back into the glow of chandeliers. The door closed behind them with a hush so delicate it carried the weight of cruelty more than any slam could. Left standing outside, my son straightened his tie, even though no one was watching. He walked alone down the street toward the bus stop. The evening sky had already begun to shift, streaks of amber giving way to violet. By the time he reached the corner, the lamps flickered to life, casting halos over the pavement. When the bus arrived, its doors groaned open with tired resignation. Ethan climbed aboard, the velvet box resting carefully on his lap. He chose a seat near the window where the light from passing shops washed across his face. The other passengers, strangers heading home with groceries, couples holding hands, a man humming under his breath, paid him no mind. He was just a boy in a white shirt, small and silent, staring at the blur of city lights. The ride took him through neighborhoods alive with celebration, houses glowing with warm gatherings. He pressed his forehead to the glass, watching silhouettes of families around tables, laughter spilling onto porches. Every scene was a reminder of what he had been denied. When the bus hissed to a stop near our street, he stepped down carefully, shoes scuffing against the curb. The sky had darkened fully. Night spread thick above him. He walked the short block to our home, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the quiet. Inside, the house greeted him with stillness. He placed the velvet box on the counter, untouched, unopened. Then he moved to the kitchen, pulled out 2 slices of bread, spread peanut butter across, and them with careful strokes. He added an apple, one already half-eaten from earlier, and sat at the table. That was his wedding feast. No clinking glasses, no music, no photographs, just the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet chewing of a 10-year-old boy who had been told by his own blood that he did not matter enough to sit among them. When I finally walked through the door that night, exhaustion still clinging to my body from the ER, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the usual quiet of a house settling into evening, but a hollow absence, the kind that pressed against the walls and seeped into the floorboards. The kitchen light was on, casting its tired glow over the table, and there sat Ethan, shoulders slumped, a plate in front of him. 2 slices of bread, 1 apple core pushed to the side, and a glass of water, half drunk. The bread had gone stiff around the edges. The peanut butter was smeared unevenly, as if spread by hands too small for the task. My son lifted his eyes to me, and in that gaze I saw not tears, not rage, but something far heavier. He looked at me with resignation, as if the world had delivered its verdict and he had accepted it. "I ate," he said simply, pointing to the crusts still left behind. His voice was level, but the steadiness only deepened the ache inside me. I pulled off my jacket, tossed it carelessly onto the couch, and sat beside him. The velvet box rested unopened near the fruit bowl, a silent witness to the night's cruelty. I reached out, touching it gently, but he shook his head. "They didn't want me there," he said, almost too softly to hear. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch forever, he added, "I don't belong to them." The words sliced deeper than any scalpel I had ever held. I felt my chest constrict, a suffocating weight settling beneath my ribs, because I knew exactly what he meant. Those same words had echoed through my own childhood in unspoken ways. I had heard them in the dismissive chuckles of my father, in the narrowed eyes of my mother whenever I spoke too eagerly about books, in the way Daniel's smallest accomplishments were celebrated, while mine were minimized to nothing. Now my son was repeating my history, and I realized with a jolt that the cycle had found its next victim. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into me, feeling the fragility of his frame pressed against my chest. He didn't cry. Neither did I. Instead, we sat in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't need explanation because it speaks louder than words. I stroked his hair, and in that motion, I was soothing not only the boy in front of me, but also the girl I once was, the child who longed for her parents' approval and never received it. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though apology felt like pouring water into a well without bottom. Sorry that I couldn't shield him from them. Sorry that his faith in family had been tested so early. Sorry that I had once believed things might change if I just kept giving, kept paying, kept proving myself. He looked up at me again, eyes wide, too old for his 10 years. "It's not your fault, Mom. They don't see us." His words were simple, yet they contained a clarity I had spent decades circling without ever naming. "They don't see us." That was the truth. They had never seen me, and now they had refused to see him. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, a low mechanical sigh, while the clock on the wall ticked steadily, indifferent to the fracture in our family. I reached across the table and pulled the velvet box closer. Opening it felt like a ritual, a reclaiming. Inside gleamed the polished tie clip, small and dignified, the kind of gift a boy chooses when he wants to say, "I thought of you. I wanted you to be proud." I placed it back into his hands. "This means something, Ethan. Even if they turned away, what you did tonight still matters." He studied it for a long time, thumb running over the cool metal. His lips tightened, but he nodded, and in that nod, I saw the faintest spark of resilience. That night, after I tucked him into bed, I lingered in the doorway. He had rolled onto his side, clutching the box like a talisman. The shadows stretched across his room, the faint sound of crickets rising through the window. I stood there, frozen, because the memory of my own childhood bedroom came rushing back. I remembered lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why love always seemed conditional, why I felt invisible in my own home. And now, decades later, my son was walking the same path of quiet hurt. But unlike me, he was not alone. This time, someone would fight back. I closed his door gently, the latch clicking with resolve. For years, I had swallowed their cruelty, paid their bills, absorbed their scorn. But seeing Ethan at that table, eating bread instead of wedding cake, stripped away any hesitation I had left. This was not going to be another silent night. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house with a knot in my stomach. Sleep had barely touched me. All night, I replayed Ethan's words, the bread on the table, the echo of my own childhood loneliness. By the time the sun rose, the decision was carved into me like bone. I was not going to let their silence become our inheritance. Their house looked the same as always. Fresh paint on the porch, neat hedges, wind chimes swaying lazily in the breeze. Normal, comfortable, deceptive. I parked, walked up the steps, and rang the bell. My mother answered in her pressed blouse, hair pinned tight, her face lighting briefly before her smile faltered. "You should have called," she said, stepping aside reluctantly. I walked straight into the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had eaten countless meals as a girl, feeling like a guest in my own home. The smell of brewed coffee filled the air. My father sat at the table with his paper, a can of beer already, cracked open beside him, though it was barely 10 in the morning. Clara, still in a satin robe, perched on the counter, her legs swinging as if the house already belonged to her. I planted myself across from them and asked the question that had burned in my chest since last night. There were 28 seats in that hall. Why was there no room for my son? The words dropped heavy, shaking the air between us. My father lowered his paper, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't invited, simple as that. Clara's lips curved into something that might have been sympathy if it weren't sharpened with condescension. It was a wedding, Isla. Guest lists are complicated. We couldn't just fit everyone. I turned my eyes to my mother, waiting, needing something resembling remorse. Instead, she clasped her mug, looked me straight in the face, and delivered the line that burned hotter than any scalpel ever had. "If you really care about being part of this family, you'll help us pay Clara's tuition. That's what a supportive daughter does. You cover the costs, and we'll let this go." The air seemed to collapse. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "Tuition?" My voice cracked not from weakness, but from the sheer absurdity. "You left my 10-year-old grandson outside your door, and now you're asking me to buy forgiveness with money?" Her jaw tightened. "Don't exaggerate. He wasn't harmed, but Clara's degree is an investment in the family. If you step up, everything can move forward." My father chuckled, shaking his head as if I were the unreasonable one. "Always so dramatic, Isla. You think every slight is a tragedy? The boy had a sandwich. He'll live. But Clara's education, that's a legacy worth protecting." I stared at them, the people who raised me, the people who had conditioned me to believe my worth lay in what I could provide. And for a split second, I saw my younger self at this very table, hunched over a textbook while they dismissed me, ridiculed me, praised Daniel for simply existing. "Ethan deserved a seat," I said, forcing each word out slowly, evenly, so they could not mistake rage for hysteria. "He deserved a place at your table more than half the strangers you invited to fill the room." Clara rolled her eyes, sliding off the counter. "You're making this about you, as always. It was Daniel's day. Not everything has to revolve around your son." The spike hit then, sharp and unrelenting. I felt my hands tremble, but not with weakness, with fury controlled so tightly it hummed through my veins. "This isn't about me," I said. "It's about decency, about a 10-year-old child walking home alone because his grandparents couldn't spare him a chair." My mother slammed her mug onto the table, liquid splashing onto the wood. "Stop acting like a martyr. If you can afford to waste money on your career, you can afford to support your family. Pay for Clara's tuition, and we'll forget this nonsense. If not, don't come here demanding apologies we don't owe." The room went still, except for the hum of the refrigerator. My father leaned back, smirking, waiting for me to fold as I always had. Clara crossed her arms, confident that her place in the family hierarchy was cemented. But I no longer recognized myself in the woman who used to nod and quietly pay. That woman had been replaced by someone else last night, standing in a dim kitchen beside her son, watching him eat bread instead of cake. I pushed back my chair and rose, my voice steady, almost calm. "Then I suppose we have nothing left to discuss?" My mother's eyes widened, perhaps expecting me to argue, to bargain, to yield. My father scoffed, muttering under his breath. Clara smirked, certain she had won. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly see, was that I had already decided. Their rejection had planted a seed, and soon they would learn that my silence carried more power than their demands. I turned, walked out, and let the door close behind me. I drove away from their house with my hands steady on the wheel and a storm pressing behind my sternum. Arguments would have fed them, excuses would have prolonged the rot. I needed clarity, my son needed a boundary no one could mistake. I parked outside our building, climbed the stairs, and spread documents across the kitchen table like a surgeon laying out instruments. Deed, mortgage, utility accounts, insurance policy numbers. Each line proved what they refused to see. I had been the scaffolding holding their comfort upright. I opened a new document and began to write. The letter would be brief. Precision carries authority. I identified myself by full name and address. I referenced the property by parcel number. I listed every account I had paid for 7 years. Then I wrote the sentence that shifted our family's balance. Effective immediately, all financial assistance is terminated. No further payments will be made on your behalf. I added dates, balances, and a firm deadline by which they were to assume responsibility. I noted that future requests must go directly to providers. My accounts were closed to them. I ended with a plain fact. The condominium remains under my ownership. Your occupancy depends on paying costs going forward. I read it aloud, cut every extra word, then printed 2 copies. I signed both in blue ink. One copy I sealed for their door. The other I prepared for certified mail with a notarized affidavit for my lunch break. I photographed the pages beside that day's newspaper. Strategy is not cruelty. It is protection. Before dawn, I slipped out, the city still gray and damp. The hedges smelled of cut grass. Wind chimes ticked like a clock counting down. I slid the envelope into the gap by the jam where the paper always rested. I considered ringing. Then I pictured Ethan's hands around the velvet box and walked back to the car. Silence would speak for me. From the end of the block, I watched the door open. My mother's robe was cinched tight. She bent for the paper, paused, and saw the envelope. She recognized my handwriting. A flinch crossed her shoulders. She tore it open on the step, eyes widening. She called for my father with a sharp bark. He shuffled out in yesterday's shirt and snatched the letter. They did not read. They hunted for loopholes. Finding none, the noise began. My mother shouted that I had forfeited any claim to be her daughter, that decent children support their elders without keeping score. She waved the pages like a surrender flag and ripped them down the middle, fibers squealing. My father cursed and accused me of ingratitude. He bellowed that I would crawl back after I cooled off. I did not move. The certified copy would arrive. The affidavit would stand. The bank would reject any attempt to bill my accounts. The deed carried my signature. The utilities were switching out of my name at noon. Strategy works best when it demands no further argument. My phone buzzed, 3 missed calls stacked before I silenced it. I could predict the script: guilt, rage, then promises to change if I restored the money. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat. In the ER, we treat the cause, not the noise. The cause was a system built on my compliance. I had just withdrawn the power that kept it alive. By the time the sun cleared the roofs, their voices fell to a furious hiss. My mother jabbed a finger at the mailbox as if the metal had offended her. My father kicked a torn page into the hedge. I started the engine and drove to work. the world outside taking on color. I had not shouted. I had not begged. I had written the truth and signed my name. In triage, a man gripped my arm and asked if he would make it. I told him yes, because we had a plan. Plans save lives. Plans also save children from slow harm. At lunch, I mailed the second packet and filed the affidavit with a notary who did not ask questions. I finally breathed for the first time in years. When I returned to the ER, my hands were steady. The line I had drawn would hold. I walked into the law office the next morning with a folder so heavy it bent my shoulder bag. The receptionist looked up, offered a professional smile, and directed me to a quiet waiting area. My pulse was steady, my breath even. I had spent the night checking each document twice. When the door opened and a man in his 50s introduced himself as Attorney Walsh, I rose, shook his hand firmly, and followed him into a conference room lined with dark shelves. He gestured for me to sit, then asked why I'd come. I placed the folder between us and slid it across the table. I need to formalize what has already begun, I told him. He raised a brow, curious but not dismissive. He opened the folder and paused when he saw the organization. Dividers, labels, dated receipts, notarized copies. For 7 years, I had kept everything. Every mortgage payment I had made, every insurance renewal, every transfer covering their utilities. I had even retained the statements showing the direct debits from my own account to theirs. Each page was stacked in order, month by month, with highlighted notes. Walsh flipped through silently, occasionally nodding, his eyes scanning the totals. "Most people walk in here with stories," he said finally. "You walked in with proof." I leaned forward. "Stories can be twisted. Paper cannot." He asked me to explain the background, so I did. I described how my parents had dismissed me as a child, how I had become the invisible hand propping up their household while raising Ethan alone. I explained how Clara had encouraged them to drain me further, even suggesting my money should fund her wedding. I outlined the cruelty at Daniel's ceremony, the moment they turned their disdain on my son. My voice never broke. Every detail was anchored by the evidence in front of him. Walsh tapped the folder gently. "You already ended the payments?" "Yes." I sent notice. Effective immediately. I filed an affidavit with a notary and mailed certified copies. This is not a warning. It's a shift of power. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "What you've done is legally sound. They cannot compel you to support them. In fact, with this record, you could pursue reimbursement if you wished." The idea made me pause. I had never thought about taking anything back. My goal had been freedom, not revenge measured in dollars. Still, the fact that I could, if I chose, sent a quiet spark through me. "I want clarity," I said. "I want them to know this isn't emotional whiplash. It's structure. They can no longer treat me as a permanent wallet." Walsh leaned back. "Then we will draft a formal declaration. We'll reference each account, each payment, and close with notice that future attempts to involve you financially will be considered harassment. With the evidence you've provided, it will hold." I nodded. Relief brushed against me like cool air. This was not a rant scribbled in anger. It was a strategy written with ink and law. Walsh asked if I wished to establish a trust for Ethan, to separate his security from family entanglements. I agreed without hesitation. We sketched the first outlines of an education fund, one they would never touch, one that would belong solely to him. As he described the structure, I imagined Ethan years from now, safe from the weight I had carried. When I left the office, the sun was high, the city restless with traffic. I carried my folder back to the car, lighter now that the burden had been witnessed. The calls from my parents continued to blink on my phone, messages growing more frantic, but they no longer unsettled me. Each ring was powerless against notarized proof, against the legal firewall I was building. Driving home, I thought about how easy it would have been to scream at them, to beg them to love me differently. But that would have kept me in their arena, where cruelty masqueraded as family tradition. Instead, I had shifted the ground entirely. I had turned silence and preparation into leverage. That evening, Ethan asked why I looked calmer. I told him, because sometimes strength doesn't sound like shouting, it looks like being ready. He smiled, perhaps not fully understanding yet, but sensing that the tides had changed. What I had set in motion was no outburst. It was 7 years of foresight crystallized into action. The law was now a witness, and silence had become my sharpest weapon. The counterattack began before breakfast. Missed calls stacked up. An aunt texted that my parents were in pieces. I poured coffee and let the phone buzz against the counter until Daniel's name appeared. I answered on the second ring. Isla, you cannot be serious. All this over a chair? I watched the narrow strip of sky outside the kitchen window. No, this is my childhood and my son's. It is every time you were handed applause while I was told to shrink. It is last night when a 10-year-old was told he did not belong. He blew out a performative sigh. You're blowing it up. Weddings are messy. Seating charts are brutal. We did our best. Your best would have made room for a child with your last name, I said. Your best would have called him back from the door. He shifted to guilt. Mom says you blindsided them. Dad has not stopped yelling. Just talk to them and take it back. I did not blindside anyone. I documented 7 years of bills. I ended a pattern. They raised us, he pressed. You cannot cut them off like strangers. They made me the provider. They chose money over respect. I will not finance my own child's humiliation. You're always dramatic, he snapped. I hung up before the word could tighten around my throat. More calls followed. My mother left a wailing voicemail about loyalty. My father texted balances as if numbers were shackles. Clara sent one line, "We all have roles. Try not to forget yours." Their idea of mine had built the trap I was finally stepping out of. At noon, my parents called together on speaker. I answered because resolve is not avoidance. My mother began, brittle. People are calling. Do you enjoy embarrassing your family? I enjoy none of it, I said. I am done paying for the privilege of being disrespected. My father cut in. Ungrateful, after everything we've done. You built a life on my accounts, I said. I am closing them. That is a boundary. Bring the payments back, he ordered, like resetting a thermostat. We'll forget your tantrum. We'll even forgive the letter. Number. There is nothing to forgive. There is only change. He snorted. You'll crawl back when you cool off. I let silence widen. Behind them, glasses clinked. A television murmured. The house still believed itself untouchable. My mother tried sweetness. We can smooth this if you put Clara's tuition on your card. She'll repay you. Clara is not my dependent, I said. And even if she were, kindness to a child should not cost tuition. The veneer cracked. Do not act righteous, she hissed. People will see what you are. What am I? A cold woman who values money over family. I breathe the way I do when a trauma bay turns messy. Number, I value family enough to end the harm. I value my son enough to teach him that love without respect is not love. I ended the call. The afternoon became logistics. I changed passwords, canceled drafts, removed my information from every account. Each click felt like a stitch closing a wound. Ethan did homework at the table, glancing up. I met his eyes and smiled. Steadiness is contagious. Near dusk, Daniel called again, softer. They're panicking. Could you meet them halfway? I have met them more than halfway for 7 years, I said. Last night I saw the distance they will not cross. It was never that serious, he said. It was exactly that serious. You just never had to feel it. A small sound came across the line. Maybe sorry, maybe nothing. The call ended. By nightfall, the messages thinned. I washed mugs, packed Ethan's lunch, laid out my scrubs. The counterattack had spent itself on threats and guilt. None of it touched the foundation I had poured. The house was quiet but not empty. It felt like the first steady breath after a long underwater swim. Morning would require the next move. Neighbors texted screenshots from a family thread I was no longer in. An uncle wrote that I had forgotten where I came from. A cousin claimed hospital stress had made me unstable. I offered no explanations. Arguments would feed the fire. Instead, I saved every message, noted timestamps, and placed them with my records. Facts, not fury, would carry me into the next step. I kept breathing on purpose. By Monday, it was clear my parents were not moving. Utilities had been transferred out of my name on Friday. I paid the final balances and sent confirmations. On Saturday, the lights were still on. On Sunday, the oven door was propped open for warmth. Monday morning, my mother sent a photo of porch flowers as if to say, "We are settled. Your letter meant nothing." I drove past the building on my way to the hospital. The curtains I had bought hung neatly in the front window. A stranger might think the place belonged to them. The deed, however, sat in my safe with my signature bright under the notary's seal. They had performed ownership because I allowed it. That ended now. At lunch, I called Walsh. He cleared a slot that afternoon. I brought the folder and fresh notes, transfer dates, closure confirmations, certified mail receipts. He scanned the pages. "They are refusing to assume responsibility," he said. "You have options." "I want clean lines," I answered. "We can issue a notice to vacate," he replied, tapping the statute on his screen. "They are occupants without a lease. The period is short. If they ignore it, we go to court." A notice meant confrontation. Court meant spectacle. But I pictured Ethan's white shirt and the unopened tie clip. "Do it." He drafted while I watched. The notice was concise and lawful. I signed. A courier delivered it before dinner. 30 days, vacate, remove property, return keys. My phone erupted. I muted it, cooked Ethan pasta, and helped with fractions. The next morning, my mother called from a neighbor's phone. "You cannot throw your parents on the street," she declared. "You could have chosen respect," I answered. "You chose comfort? We made you who you are." Number one made me. They did not leave. They moved possessions from room to room as if rearranging could rewrite law. My father stacked boxes in the hall. My mother arranged framed photos and texted pictures of Daniel as a toddler. Clara joked about squatters' rights. Daniel asked me to let feelings cool. On day 5, I met a real estate agent. The condo had become infection. It needed an incision. We toured that evening. The agent whistled at the upgrades I had paid for. "Inventory is tight," she said. "If this lists, it will move." She asked about occupancy. "Owner controlled," I said. "Vacant at closing." Within 48 hours, we had 3 offers. One buyer stood out. A young teacher with a small daughter and a promise to keep the balcony garden. Her letter was brief. She wanted a place to root. Walsh reviewed the offer. The numbers were fair, the timeline clean. One condition: vacant possession. I signed the acceptance. Vacant meant no more pretending. Either my parents would leave on their own, or a marshal would open the door and a locksmith would change the cylinder. My hands trembled, not from doubt but from enforcing reality. When the deadline arrived, nothing had moved. My father texted, "Try it, you won't." My mother told Daniel to stall me with sentiment. He came to my door with stories from when we were small. I poured water. He said, "This is going too far." "Last night was too far," I said. "This is a boundary." "Consider the neighbors," he pleaded. "People will talk." "Let them," I said. "They did not watch your nephew eat bread on his uncle's wedding night." Court took 1 week. Walsh laid out the documents in a careful line. I spoke little. The paper did the talking. The judge read, asked 2 narrow questions, and granted possession with a date certain. We stepped into sun that felt newly honest. Walsh said, "You built this case long before you walked in." The writ posted on the door gleamed like a warning. My parents raged, then bargained, then fell into sullen quiet. On moving day, they still had not packed, so the marshal waited while they stuffed bags and muttered. I did not attend. I took Ethan for pancakes and promised we would buy a fern for our window. At noon, my phone buzzed. Done. That afternoon, the buyer's little girl skipped across the empty living room, her shoes tapping on wood I had refinished. The balcony garden looked greener. I handed the keys to the agent and signed the last form. Vacant meant new air, The stage was cleared. A story that had used my silence for years could not rely on it anymore. It finally belonged to truth again. I did not watch the marshal open the door. I kept my promise to Ethan and took him for pancakes. Then we walked the long block around the park until the hour passed. When my phone vibrated with the single word, "done," I turned toward the building where my parents had lived on my signature for 7 years. Sunlight was unforgiving. Hard midday light. It showed every scuff on the stair rail, every chip in the paint I had paid to refresh. A moving van idled by the curb. Cardboard boxes, some new, sat in a sloppy row on the sidewalk. My father argued with the driver about the hourly rate while my mother supervised the stacking as if authority might change the terms. I stayed across the street for a breath, holding Ethan's hand, reminding myself watching is not the same as gloating. Watching proves a boundary holds. Clara spotted me first. She stepped off the stoop in a tailored coat, heels impractical on cracked concrete, and crossed with a half smile that never reached her eyes. "Take a good look," she said, voice sweetened like tea left too long in the sun. "Your son will see you as the one who destroyed this family." Ethan's fingers tightened around mine. Before I could answer, he lifted his chin and spoke with quiet certainty. "I only need you, Mom." The words were soft, the effect was seismic. Clara's smile thinned. Her gaze flicked to the velvet box peeking from Ethan's pocket and back to my face, searching for weakness. I kept my tone level. My heart was steady, my breath even. I did not destroy anything. I removed a lie. My father barked across the hood of the van. "If you had an ounce of compassion, you'd stop this circus." "Compassion paid your bills," I said. "Accountability moved you out." The marshal stood by the door, neutral, clipboard under his arm. A locksmith knelt, slipping the cylinder into place with the focus I recognize in operating rooms. Click. A clean start. My mother clutched a framed photo of Daniel at 3, as if the image might persuade the building to release her back inside. She turned on me with a rehearsed tremble. "You will regret this. When Ethan grows up, he will resent you." Ethan eased closer to my side. "No, Grandma," he said, polite but unmoving. "I know who left me outside." The driver closed the van's roll door. The slam rang like a gavel. Clara tried one last time, leaning in so only I could hear. "You look calm now, but this will haunt you. You should have kept paying and kept quiet. That is the role that suited you." "Silence used to serve you," I replied. "It no longer serves me." For a moment, no one moved. Air hung heavy with engine fumes and the smell of hot asphalt. Then the marshal nodded to the locksmith, the new keys glinting in his palm. Legal, final, simple. My parents shuffled toward the van. My father refused to look at me. My mother looked too long, hoping to wring guilt from eye contact. Nothing watered her grip. A neighbor approached with a casserole balanced in hands, confusion on her face. She glanced between my parents and me, unsure where the story began. I spared her the explanation. Families collapse in private. Strangers should not be asked to hold the rubble. Ethan tugged my sleeve. "Can we go now?" he asked. I looked at the window boxes I had planted, geraniums still flaming red, and felt something unclench. "Yes," I said. "We are finished here." We walked away before the van pulled into traffic. I did not turn back. The city noise replaced the static in my head. Sirens, a bus braking, a cyclist's bell. Ethan swung our joined hands once, a small boy's habit he had not outgrown. He looked up at me, searching, perhaps for sign of doubt. I gave him the truth I could bear. "There are endings that feel wrong when they are right," I said. "This is one of them, but we are safe." We crossed at the light. A gust lifted the edges of the eviction notice taped to the glass. Then it fell flat again. Boundaries like paper can flutter. Still, they hold. We walked together. The week after the eviction felt like weather breaking after a long storm. My parents signed a month-to-month lease at the edge of town, a squat building with peeling paint, a hallway light that buzzed, and a radiator that clanked like a loose pipe. They sent cheerful photos to the family thread. The angles lied, the walls told the truth. Clara wrapped the story in ribbon online. Off camera, she called from blocked numbers and accused me of cruelty. Daniel texted a softer plea. Could I cover their deposit and first month just until they get settled? I replied with 12 words I had practiced in my head. I do not fund adults who refuse to behave like adults. By day 10, my father hated the drafty windows. By day 12, my mother blamed loud neighbors. By day 14, Clara loathed the commute. Need had always expanded to fill whatever money allowed. Now it met limits. Deposits required signatures, utilities demanded names, groceries required planning. Daniel tried to bridge the gap. He delivered takeout, changed bulbs, and sat between them while they argued about thermostats. One evening, he called me from his car with the engine off. They keep saying you broke the family, he said. Could you meet them halfway? I did for 7 years, I answered. Halfway is where I lived. He exhaled and said he understood. By month 2, the performance cracked. Clara stopped posting cheerful captions and started sending midnight lectures about duty. Parents are sacred, she typed. Family is everything. I read and felt nothing change. Sacred is not a word I attach to people who bar a child from a table. Everything is not a word for systems that run on one person's endless giving. Ethan steadied. He moved the velvet box from his dresser to the shelf beside his favorite books, saying it belonged next to stories that last. He slept deeper and laughed easier. The apartment felt larger. An aunt accused me of abandonment. I sent documents. A cousin posted a vague status. I ignored it. Stories starve when you stop feeding them. She did not ask to come in, and I did not invite her. They cannot stay there, she announced. It is breaking them. They can adapt, I said. People do. Her smile sharpened. Your son will hate you. Ethan stepped into the hall, backpack still on. I do not, he said. I know what happened. Clara blinked, recalculated, retreated down the stairs. Daniel called that night, voice low. She is done, he admitted. She says she cannot keep propping them up. You have 2 choices, I said. Let them solve their problem or move them in and learn the lesson I learned. He gave a humorless laugh. You make it sound like weather. It ends when the wind stops, not when someone throws money at the sky. Month 3 brought smaller rooms. The landlord raised the rent. They complained. Sympathy thinned. I responded to no one. Distance is not unkind. Sometimes it is the only kindness left. Ethan and I built a quiet rituals. Saturday market flowers, Sunday hikes where service drops and birds keep time. On a ridge above the river, I finally said the sentence out loud, to him and to myself. I am not paying the price anymore. They reap what they sow. He nodded as if the words had always been his. We walked past the old building after dinner. The balcony boxes overflowed with basil and cherry tomatoes. The buyer's little girl watered them in a yellow dress, her tongue peeking out with concentration. Ethan watched, then smiled. Feels different, he said. It is different, I answered. The place belongs to someone who can love it without taking from someone else. Clara stopped calling. Daniel's texts became sky photos and weather notes, a truce made of small talk. Updates reached me secondhand. A tripped breaker, a small leak, a birthday cake bought with coupons. None of it made me triumphant. All of it kept me firm. In early spring, Ethan asked to donate the tie clip to the school charity sale. Maybe it will become a good gift for someone else, he said. I handed him the velvet box and felt the knot in my chest loosen. He wrapped it carefully and slid it into his backpack. We did not need souvenirs. We needed air. For the first time in years, we had enough. We stepped into lighter days. The new apartment was small, but to us it felt vast. Light spilled through thin curtains, bouncing off walls freshly painted in soft cream. For the first time in years, laughter did not feel borrowed or conditional. It belonged here, within these 4 walls. Ethan ran from room to room as if he had been gifted a castle, every corner transformed into a stage for his imagination. I watched him, my chest unclenching, realizing how heavy the old house had been, how every favor I paid for, every bill I covered, had shackled me in silence. I sold the family property. With the money, I started a modest education fund in Ethan's name. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. No strings, no demands, no voices calling me selfish while draining me dry. For years, my paycheck disappeared into someone else's comfort. Now, every dollar spoke of possibility. Evening meals shifted into rituals of joy. We cooked simple dishes together, pasta with too much cheese, soups that filled the kitchen with warmth. Ethan would sometimes set the table with mismatched cups and declare it a banquet. Watching him smile, I knew that breaking from my parents was not destruction, it was creation. We were rebuilding a life where belonging was unquestionable. I no longer measured worth by how much I gave away. Instead, I measured by how often my son laughed freely, how often he fell asleep without the weight of rejection pressing on his shoulders. My parents had told him there was no place for him. Here, in this little apartment, we carved out a place that no one could deny. One afternoon, Ethan brought home a second-hand trumpet. The sound was rough, uneven, but to me it carried more music than any polished orchestra. As he practiced, he paused and looked at me. "Mom, do you regret it? Giving up the house, walking away from them?" The question lingered. My mind replayed images I thought I had buried. The unopened gift box in his hands that night, the untouched slice of bread, the silence in our kitchen after the wedding. Painful, yes, but also clarifying. Those moments carved out truth. I knelt beside him and touched his shoulder. "No, sweetheart, I don't regret it. We didn't lose a family. We found our place." He nodded slowly, lifted the trumpet again, and blew a trembling note that echoed against the walls. The sound was imperfect, yet it filled the room with something whole. That evening, we shared dinner at our new table, light catching on the edges of mismatched plates. It wasn't luxury, but it was luminous. Unlike that night of isolation, tonight was full of food, of warmth, of belonging. The table was no longer a place of exclusion. It was a circle of us two, strong and complete. As Ethan's tune wavered in the background, I realized closure wasn't about revenge alone. It was about replacing silence with sound, emptiness with fullness, rejection with presence. My parents' choices had defined my childhood, but they would not define my son's. Before we say goodbye, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with coffee in hand, or a late night when stories like this keep you company? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. If this story touched you, consider subscribing, not just for more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, in second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us. Wherever you are, carry this story with you. Remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock loudly. Sometimes it waits quietly until your heart is ready to open.